Send a special greetings to anyone who joined us at World Pride yesterday. My name is Josh Hollins. I'm a student activist at the University of Hull, where I'm also a member of the SWP. We have three speakers there. I'm going to introduce them all individually. They're going to speak for about 10 minutes each, and then I'm going to open up the floor to questions and contributions. We're not going to use the speaker slip system in this meeting, so if you just indicate, and I'll call you, but I'll remind you that a little bit later. So, our first speaker in the session is a leading member of the SWP and the author of the book Red in the Rainbow, Hamidi.
Okay, I wanted to start with yesterday's Pride, because I think in many ways it was a really fantastic event. Once again, we saw huge numbers of people coming out onto the streets, some coming to hold hands in public for the first time, many to confidently celebrate and assert their sexuality and gender identity, but also to express anger at a society that oppresses us and to bring out onto the streets the many different fights that we are involved in. The fight against the cuts, the fight against the rise in hate crime, the fight for the right of asylum seekers to be welcome here, but also to use World Pride to show a real solidarity with people fighting around the world. And I think that one of the best moments yesterday for me really was when the crowds in Trafalgar Square responded to what was quite a disgraceful decision by the Pride organisers to allow the stage to be used to essentially promote Israel as a tourist destination for LGBT people, was to say that we will not forget the oppression of Palestinians and to unfurl their Palestinian flags, turning it into into a pro-Palestinian rally inside of Trafalgar Square. Know that yesterday's event was marred not only by the poor politics of some of the organisers, but also by a real failure of a whole range of institutions that had promised to bring the biggest Pride ever in our history to London. Instead, with just days to go, we were told that due to a financial shortfall, that the event was going to be scaled down, that we were going to have to march 2 hours earlier, that all the floats that people had spent months preparing for were going to be pulled. And it meant that many people were stranded, unable to get to Pride on time, but also you had elderly and disabled groups unable to come on the march. And I think we have to ask why did this happen, and it's something that many of us have warned about for a long time, which is really that for too long our pride has been turned away from being a protest. It's been turned away from an assertion of our civil rights and our desire for liberation, and it's being run like a business geared towards selling Pride as a marketing opportunities for the corporate sponsors to make money out of us on the day and to parade their supposedly gay-friendly credentials. And I think we have to ask, where were these so-called friends when they didn't step in to make up the shortfall that we needed to ensure that Pride went ahead? Where was the likes of Barclays, who were happy to have their little logo tagged on the Pride publicity, couldn't come up with what would amount to 0.05% of the golden handshake that Bob Diamond walked away with? Why did London Mayor Boris Johnson, who paraded around with his pink hat at last year's Pride, despite his comments that gay marriage was comparable to a union between three men and a dog, refused to stomp up the money? And why were the police demanding money to police our protest? Since when did we have to pay for the right to protest against our oppression? That this began as a militant celebration of the Stonewall riots, when LGBT people fought back against police bullying and harassment, and they drove them from the streets of New York with bricks and bottles, and they sung and danced, and they demanded a revolution that would bring us liberation. This is a political attack by the Tories and by the police, and we have to respond by saying there will be no turning back, that our Pride is a protest. And we have to make sure that the spirit of resistance that people brought to Pride yesterday will be taken into the Prides that will be taking place around the country following Marxism. But I think we also have to ask, what kind of protest is going to be necessary to achieve our liberation? Because we have come a long way, but there is also an enormously long way to go. We can have a day like yesterday where we can walk openly through the borough of Westminster, but that is a borough where hate crime increased by 26% last year. We can have a party in Trafalgar Square at the end of our march, but this is the square where Ian Bainham was brutally kicked to death in a homophobic attack. And this is part of a wider picture taking place of increased attacks against LGBT people in many major cities. And it's been fuelled by a context of crisis and austerity in which we are seeing politicians seeking to divert people's anger onto scapegoats, trying to get us to blame Muslims, multiculturalism, people on benefits, the disabled, to blame the poor. That is their message, and in that context, other oppressed groups like LGBT people are becoming fair game. And it is helping to give confidence to fascist organisations like the English Defence League to take to the streets to whip up vile Islamophobia, but also to try and present a progressive image by wrapping themselves in the LGBT flag and launching an LGBT division that parrots the myth that Muslims are all homophobic. So the EDL have now had the cheek to call a march on Saturday, this Saturday coming, to coincide with Bristol Pride, calling on the LGBT community to support them because we have a common enemy in Muslims. But I think we are very clear about where our common enemy lies, because just as they have rampaged through Muslim areas after their marches, they have attacked gay bars and clubs. They have torn up the rainbow flag. And we don't forget what their mates in the PMP did when Nick Griffin went on primetime TV, Question Time, to say that gay men kissing was creepy, something that led to a spate of attacks, including on James Parks in Liverpool, who nearly lost his life. And this is why it's so important that Bristol Pride has said that they are going to be supporting the We Are Bristol anti-fascist mobilisation, and that Pride and We Are Bristol are going to be joining together to kick the EDL out of Bristol on Saturday. Cuts, because it's already led to the closure of vital LGBT organisations, it's removing public services, benefits and funding that are a lifeline for working class LGBT people. Trans people are being denied surgery. Students who feel unable to come out to their parents are finding their access to university barred. And you look at Cameron's most recent proposals to remove benefits from under 25s. If they can't get a job, they should be living with their parents. This will have a devastating effect on young LGBT people who already make up 30% of the homeless in urban areas. This is the reality of Cameron's big society, pulling away welfare support and organisations that have been built up over decades and leaving people with nothing if they can't get family support. And it's going to hit LGBT people particularly hard. And, you know, we know that it's a bit of a joke when Cameron says that we're all in it together. But I think it's also just as true of the notion that we're all just one LGBT community. Because there are many more gay MPs in the Tory party than in any other parliamentary party at the moment. But what use is that to us when they're driving through vicious cuts, or when Cameron seeds the bigots by giving them a vote on free marriage? But it is one reflection of the way in which a layer of LGBT people have been able to climb up the ladder of society to the point that their lives are increasingly removed from the bread and butter issues of pay, jobs, housing and access to services which profoundly shape the lives of working class LGBT people. And it's why the Pride Organising Committee looks so out of touch when they could claim that most of us live in a privileged society where we can take for granted the privileges we enjoy. These sharp divides run through many political questions of the day. It has been really shocking to see the pink press running articles like "My enemy's enemy is my friend" of the EDL, and commentators lining up with attacks on Muslims as uniquely homophobic and supporting wars in the name of gay rights. Because the vast majority of us live and work side by side with Muslims and other people from all walks of life. And sure, sometimes you have to have arguments, but you don't win arguments by colluding in attacks on other oppressed groups. And that's why many of us marched against the war that we were told would liberate Iraqi people, but left 500,000 dead. But also recognise that the best thing that we can do to build solidarity with people around the world is to make sure that our governments are not able to bomb, occupy and sell arms to other countries in our name. And I think that's why we have to reject this idea that our liberation can be fought in separation from fighting the wider inequalities and injustices in the world. And that means that we have to look to how we root our struggle within the wider resistance that is rising against austerity and injustice. It means we've got to throw our full force into mobilising and building support for the TUC March Against Austerity, the National Student Demonstration and further strikes that are set to take place in the autumn. Because any win against this government will make all the other fights that we are waging and that we saw brought out on Pride far, far easier. But it's also because this is a central part of a process that can help to win unity and to establish real traditions of solidarity. I don't know if people remember the BA dispute that happened a couple of years ago. There was a strike on, and the BA pilots were used as strike breakers against the cabin crew. And they tried to whip up a kind of atmosphere against the strikers by attacking them as bum boys. And the response of the workers was to come out on the following day, on the picket line, on the demonstrations, wearing pink t-shirts in solidarity with their LGBT colleagues. And, you know, it's this tradition of winning solidarity in the working class movement that has a real deep history in our movement. It's something that I call the red in the rainbow that has been really central to achieving the gains today. And I think it's important that we look at it because it's going to be essential in terms of the battles to come. If you look at what the Tories did last time when they were in government, they tried to use a witch hunt against gays to divide our side, to drive through their attacks on the unions and working class communities. And one of the things that was key in preventing that was the way in which LGBT people organised and joined with the wider trade union movements. And a really important turning point in that was during the miners' strike, when a group of LGBT activists set up a minor support group, recognising that this was a critical battle against the Tories that would shape politics in Britain for years to come. They collected money, they organised a pink bus to tour around the picket lines, they built events in support. And now the miners didn't win, but in the course of that dispute, a real solidarity amongst the miners with LGBT people was won. And they returned that solidarity by leading the Gay Pride in 1986 with their brass band and with their banners. And what it meant was when Thatcher came to introduce Section 28, the unions mobilised, and you saw some of the biggest mobilisations for gay rights that had ever taken place in the history of Britain. And it was part of turning that tide, that acceptability of homophobia, of governments using it and political parties using it, and it was central to winning the changes in the law that came later. And that is really important, because what we have won has not been achieved by lobbying and pleading and asking for those at the top, but it has been won through radical struggles and campaigns waged from below. And that kind of politics is especially key if we want to win a freedom that goes beyond the fight for formal equality. We want that equality, but we also have to set our sights on liberation. Because our oppression is grounded in a capitalist system in which the corporates, the bankers and the rich elite dominate our lives, from the hours we put into work to the most personal aspects of our sexuality and our bodies. It is a system that demands we conform to this narrow set of sexist values at the same time as turning our sexuality and our bodies into categories that can be commodified and branded. And if we want to break that, then we've got to be part of waging a revolutionary struggle against capitalism. And that's why the working class and the question of working class is so important, because it's where the power lies to end this system, and it's something that we're beginning to see on the streets of Cairo, in Spain, and on the streets of Athens. And I just want to finish by saying what I mean by that, because sometimes that can seem a bit abstract. You know, the working class is key to achieving sexual liberation. But let's have a look at what happened in South Africa. Because this was the first country that enshrined LGBT rights in the Constitution. And actually the reason why that was able to happen was because it came off the back of a near-revolutionary struggle that was centred on the power of the working class, who paralysed the economy, who were able to draw in behind them the uprisings in the township, strikes by school students, and they brought apartheid down. But in the process, they transformed people's expectations and horizons about the kind of world that they wanted to live in. A recognition that simply to challenge the injustice of racism whilst leaving other injustices unchallenged was not to go far enough. Now, that revolution didn't happen in the end in South Africa, but it does give us a glimpse of our power, of the transformative potential of our struggle that can develop in every fight, big and small. And it's a perspective that we have to take into the struggles ahead, so that we can be part of building a bridge between the battle against austerity and oppression to socialism, a world where we win liberation.
Comrades, friends, brothers and sisters, great to see you all here. I thought a lot of you would be off watching the tennis, to be honest, so thank you for coming. I just wanted to start actually by talking about our successes, and that's not in a sense to fuel a sense of complacency, but it's to show that everything that we have gained comes through struggle, and that applies as much to LGBT liberation as it does to anything else. Now, if you're 45 or over, I won't try and pick you out, then you were born in a country where having sex with a man was a criminal offence. LGBT people were almost unanimously regarded as perverts and deviants, to be pitied or to be ridiculed. In the 1980s, when you had the few pro-LGBT politicians like Ken Livingstone, they were derided as being on the loony left for their stand. Thatcher's government introduced Section 28, reinforcing the sense of gay, lesbian, bisexuals and others as perverts and deviants who were to be contained, and for children in a sense to be kept as away from them as possible. Now when having sex with a man was legalised with huge limitations in 1967, Lord Arron, who co-sponsored the bill, said, "Lest the opponents of the bill think that a new freedom, a new privileged class has been created, let me remind them that no amount of legislation will prevent homosexuals from being the subject of dislike and derision or even pity." That was only 50 years ago, a sense that even with equality, and not even equality before the law, far from it then, but there would never be acceptance of LGBT people. And indeed, in the early 1980s, the Social Attitude Survey, which is done every year, which looks at people's attitudes in a whole range of issues, 2/3 of people thought homosexuality was always or mostly wrong. Now, things have changed, and they've changed pretty dramatically. Today, just 29% of people in England and 27% of people in Scotland think homosexuality is always or mostly wrong. We have won great victories like the equality in the age of consent, the right to adopt children, civil partnerships and protections against discrimination. But the point we always have to hammer away at, and this is why, as I say, complacency must always be avoided, is these were won not through the generosity or benevolence of those above, but by people struggling with great sacrifices from below for decades or even longer. Hannah spoke very movingly, I thought, about the Stonewall riots, but there are countless other examples, often airbrushed out of existence, of people who struggled bravely at a time when, as I say, they were attacked, ridiculed and beaten up simply for calling for basic, fundamental human rights. Now, just in terms of where we stand today and how far we've got to go, because we do have a long way to go, firstly I just want to talk about the sort of class differences in attitudes. That's interesting because often working class people are demonised and portrayed as knuckle-dragging bigots, and it's middle-class liberals in Islington just down the road in trendy wine bars who are accepting of LGBT people. For a long time, being gay was seen as a sort of bourgeois deviation, which people in public schools funneling along with each other, if you like. In fact, Stalin banned, after the Bolsheviks decriminalised homosexuality after the October Revolution, only to be banned again by Stalinism. He called it bourgeois decadence. So it's interesting today when you look at polls. There was one poll done for the Times 2 years ago which showed that the C2s, that skilled workers, were more accepting of gay people than the ABs, the professional middle classes at the top. Indeed, they were more likely to have an LGBT person in their close circle of friends. Now, it didn't surprise me. I used to be a barman in Canal Street in Manchester, and the clientele was almost exclusively local working class people of all sexualities mixing together. In terms of marriage, now, regardless of your approach to marriage, that remains a fundamental, enshrined in law, a fundamental statement that we are not equal to straight people. That is still a struggle to be fought, and in Scotland, where this is a battle which is being fought at the moment, we've had senior clergymen attacking gay people, LGBT people in the most vitriolic fashion. One of them taking to the airwaves to compare it to incest and to bestiality. Homophobia remains rampant across society. The holding hands test, if you like, which I think Hannah alluded to, of people feeling safe outside of so-called safe areas to hold hands with their lovers, remains something which is almost impossible for most of us to imagine in many parts of the community. And so much of it, in terms of this homophobia at every level of society, is, I think, linked to ongoing sexism in our society. I was in Berlin last month and I saw a poster which I think summed it up nicely. It said, "Homophobia, the fear of being treated by gay men the way you treat women." And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think the struggle against homophobia goes hand in hand with a struggle against sexism at every level of our society. We still look, if we look at TV, if we look at the media, the way LGBT people are portrayed is often in the most one-dimensional and patronising way. The way people, LGBT people, live their lives on a daily basis in Britain is often never properly reflected on. Coming out, the act of coming out, remains a seismic and often traumatic event in the lives of all LGBT people. We're looking, as Hannah spoke about, these cuts to basic services, to support services, particularly for young working class LGBT people, but also services for HIV, those with HIV, particularly, for example, in London, where there are huge cuts just last year. We're seeing a mental health crisis amongst LGBT teens. You're twice as likely, according to one study, UCL, just round the corner, apparently twice as likely as a teenager to suffer from anxiety and depression if you're LGBT. And that point, just to return that point of it being a class issue, as Hannah spoke about, is absolutely key. There was a world of difference between a Tory multimillionaire gay man like Ivan Masso and a working class teenage woman who's gay, living on a council estate in Scotland. Their lives and their experiences simply cannot be grouped together. That class division, if you like, is not something we shouldn't ever, as a movement, paper over. And just this week, Stonewall did a study, a survey of teenagers and the experience that LGBT teenagers had. The word gay was bandied around. In fact, all LGBT teenagers almost heard that term bandied around as a pejorative. Over half experienced direct bullying, and schools were failing to protect LGBT teenagers. In fact, over 2/3 said that when they were bullied, teachers, when they saw it, didn't even intervene. So I'd say this, comrades, we've come a very long way, and we should herald those successes, not least because it gives us the confidence to keep on fighting. It stops us feeling depressed or demoralised, that when we face attack, that it is possible to fight back and to win. But above all, it's absolutely crucial that we link our struggles with the struggles facing other people, whether it be young, unemployed people, whether it be Muslims who are facing Islamophobic attacks, as Hannah spoke about, whether it be the fact if you're young and black, over half are now unemployed, whether it be the attacks on disabled people. To coin a phrase, we're all in it together, apart from the people at the top, and we have to link those struggles together in order to win. And as I say, we have to be ambitious in that struggle. We're not just fighting for the emancipation of LGBT people, we're fighting against this whole rotten capitalist system to build a socialist society in which class division has been eradicated and all other forms of oppression have been eliminated too. That is our struggle for working class emancipation, for the liberation of all humanity and the end of all forms of oppression. Thank you.
Since 1970.
I'll get my walking stick out. I'm clearly very old. And I'm going to talk about Stonewall and what Stonewall is about. It constantly shocks me that people use the word Stonewall without realising what it was about. And my major theme is going to be that there really has been two souls of our movement. By our movement, I mean the LGBT movement, or used to be called the gay movement. And it's ironic that the organisation called Stonewall has almost nothing to do at all with the tradition and politics that came from Stonewall. Stonewall was a riot. It lasted 2 or 3 days, depending on whose you believe. I mean, other people claim to be in Stonewall Bar. Stonewall Bar must have been the size of Wembley Stadium by the people claiming to be there that night. It was an anti-police riot. It was a reaction against a police riot, and it was the most lowest dive you can imagine. The riot was led by people who called themselves then drag queens, and now would be called trans people. But they're the ones that led the riot. They burnt police cars. They triggered a riot in that area, and in those days, Greenwich Village wasn't the nice, leafy, middle-class areas it is now. It was the lowest of the low areas. It was full of Latinos, about 20%, Afro-American, lots of them were draft dodgers, and the dregs of society. Quite a lot of hustlers or rent boys. It was a dive, the like of which you hardly see these days, in fact. And it triggered, what's interesting about it, is that there had been similar riots, particularly by drag queens actually, before this in various bars when the police had raided them. But it gave birth to a movement, the Gay Liberation Front, and a revolution tradition within the blossoming gay movement. Now, to understand why that would happen, or why it's given bread to a tradition that almost died out in the 80s and 90s, but from yesterday's pride shows signs of reviving, is what's happening in a period of high level of struggle. And to give you a sort of taste of that, and often people say, oh, it's happening when there was civil rights, happening when there was the various women's movement, but it's all rather abstract when you sort of realise what the period was like at the time. For example, a year before, in 1968, the Black Panthers were under severe attack. They were in the dock being charged with murder. Nixon administration has decided to assassinate and murder them. They were in severe attack, and they needed to find allies. It's therefore interesting that one of the people they rang up to ask for support was Jean Genet. Now, in the 1960s, being gay was illegal, and though there were whispers and people knew that Gore Vidal was really, and that Tennessee Williams plays are really not about men and women, but hustlers and their boyfriends, and there was sort of, and Giovanni's Room was very discreet. The one notable exception to all this discreetness was Jean Genet. His novels, his plays were not just explicit, they broadcasted the fact that he was homosexual, he'd been a transvestite prostitute in Barcelona in the 30s, that he was, well, when they asked him when did he come out, he said he never was in. And he'd been raised up in, he'd been fostered and raised up in some military schools that the French had. He was the most notorious and infamous homosexual in the world. He was also very famous as a playwright and novelist by this time. Sartre called him Sir Genet, had written about him. So it's of that period that the Black Panthers, a year before Stonewall, contacted him, what they would support. And also his response is quite interesting, and it gives you a mood at the time. Because he'd also famously supported the Algerians in their fight for independence in the early 60s. A very brave thing to do when most writers shied away from supporting the Algerians and the battle for Algerian independence. He said, what do you want me to do? And he came to come and support us. And he said, and they said, when can you come? I'll be there tomorrow. So he took a plane and went to America. It's self-interesting because he had no visa. Being a convicted felon, he couldn't get a visa. So he legally entered America via Canada and then toured across the United States in 1968 with the Black Panther Party, campaigning for them and winning up support. That was the mood that gave breadth to Stonewall. It was that sort of atmosphere, where Genet and other people within what became known as the gay movement identified the homosexual, as they were called, or they called themselves at that time, was part of the oppressed, and the mood at the time was the oppressed have to fight a revolutionary war against established society. And they saw themselves as revolutionaries. So when GLF was formed, after the riots freed the area, burning cars, driving out the tactical support police, who were like the heavy guard police sent in until their shock were driven out. They went to the Free University down the road in Greenwich Village, and GLF, Gay Liberation Front, came from that meeting after a few days. They called themselves Gay Liberation Front because they named themselves after the Vietnamese that were at war with their own government. Even though the Vietnamese were Stalinist, homophobic, and on social questions quite reactionary. But they saw that their main enemy was capitalism, imperialism, their own country. So that was what GLF was about. That was the tradition of Stonewall. It's therefore deeply, deeply ironic that the Stonewall organisation in this country calls itself this. Stonewall, which gave birth to the organisation, it doesn't even support trans people at all. That it was born, it came from bricks being thrown by trans people in this country. When GLF came to this country in 1970, meeting in the LSE, I think, in 1970, it started to put the politics that came from this whole period of revolution into practice in Britain. And one of the first enemies they had was not outside straight society, it was within the gay community, because there was another organisation been around for a few years called the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, SHAE, as they used to nickname it. Campaign for Homosexual Equality was everything that Stonewall actually is. It's a campaign for homosexual equality. They were for having a quiet word with the right person in the right ear, gradual reform, and they hated the GLF. Because the GLF were for struggle, they were for revolution, they were for change. They may be confused in their ideas, but that was the tradition of the GLF. And what's happened in the last 30 years, I've seen it in front of me, has been how our movement has been taken over by this campaign for homosexual equality people. And of course we want equality. No one's saying I don't want equality. But you remember the tradition of Stonewall was that we don't want equality. We'd like, yes, of course we do. We want more than that. We don't want the same shit as the straights are having. We want a new society. We want a new way of living. We want to get rid of all these categories. We want a revolution. We want liberation, not equality. They were Gay Liberation Front, and named after a military force front, by the way. We don't want just equality, the campaign for homosexual equality. That was the tradition that got snuffed out. I was there when it got snuffed out in the 80s, really, for a number of reasons. Defeats of the working class, defeats. The AIDS epidemic wiped out a whole section of militants, particularly in America, but also in this country. And it's interesting to me to see yesterday a glimmer of a rebirth of that Stonewall mood, that there may be another way in which the LGBT movement can rekindle and remember its revolutionary tradition. Now the SWP, which also be a member of some of you, stands in that GLF Stonewall tradition, does not stand in the Stonewall organisation tradition at all. And time and time again, you see the clashes between those two. The respectables don't like the people that might frighten the horses and upset people. Time and time again, there come to clashes. I'll just give one example. I remember when there were a picket outside Parliament, they were bringing the age of consent, or voting to bring the age of consent equal, down from 18 to 16. And Stonewall were there, shepherding people to go and have a word with the MP, and they're very nice and respectable, and upturned about half a dozen gay skinheads in rubber kilts. Stonewall were mortified that this should be the image of what they should be doing, because they were quite young as well. So this was very frightening to them. And they literally wouldn't let them go in. They ushered them away. Time and time again, the respectables in the movement censor, delete, and try and get rid of the ones who were upset the apple cart. Hence their complete don't support trans issues, which is complete utter scandal. So, I want you to shut up, okay. I'll just say this. So when we see the current situation, when I started fighting for gay liberation in 74 or so, what the movement I remember Stonewall about is that revolutionary tradition. We want not just the same as everybody else, but we don't want that for everybody else. We want a new society, with a new order, with a new power. We want a new will to win.
Okay, my name is Nick. I'm a member of the SWP in Bristol. I'm also sing Out Bristol, the Southwest premier LGBT choir, which is performing on the stage at Bristol Pride next weekend. And I'm glad that Hannah mentioned the fact that Bristol Pride coincides with the EDL, because it has been quite scary and a bit exciting as to what's going to happen next weekend. The fact that the organisers of Pride have now come out in support of the Unite Against Fascism initiative against the EDL is good. But it has to be said that was not a foregone conclusion. When it was first announced that the EDL was going to march in Bristol, an initiative from Unite Against Fascism called We Are Bristol, in following the precedent set up against other EDL marches in other cities, was formed. The organisers of Bristol Pride, which has branded itself as We Are Proud, got very upset at the hijacking of the We Are word, and it ended up with some extremely frustrating and silly arguments which we really don't want to have to deal with. But unfortunately, you have to grit your teeth and do it, and it shows, if anything, how class divisions within the LGBT community are so rampant. In fact, community is a word I really don't like to use in that connection, because for a certain section of the organisers of Bristol Pride initially, they were quite happy to have a pride with all the commercial sponsors separated from the EDL, which would have the right to demonstrate in another part of town. The fact that they've come out in support of the UAF initiative has been a lot of hard work, a lot of arguing, and getting support of figures in the Labour movement, not least the Southwest TUC. So it's going to be interesting next weekend. Wish us well, and better still, come and join us.
Hi, I'm from South Africa, the only probably country in Africa where being gay it's an African. But unfortunately, before I came here, one of the interesting things is South Africa, you can get married if you're gay or lesbian. But the interesting thing is, like, when I just came here, one of the attacks on working class black women and men in South Africa who declare themselves gay every day, they've been attacked. One of the incidents that recently happened is a gay guy in the province of Limpopo was killed. His penis was cut and shoved in his mouth. And these are the realities where the working class people every day, they have to fight for their own rights, they have to declare their own spaces in that country, that so-called democratic. The frustration of unemployment, the frustration of people, the easiest way to see themselves or the easiest way to find solution is that gay people and African gay people are the problem in those communities. And I think the struggle for working class across the world should unite and fight as the working class for a new world where the scapegoat is not about being gay or who you sleep with, but it's about the fundamental change of capital and what we need to do. So I just wanted to just throw it out there that the struggle is still going on in Africa, in South Africa as well, where murders and people are being murdered amongst the frustration of capital and what it can do to people and how they use that as an scapegoat to these communities as well.
Hi, I'm Rob from Bristol Socialist Workers Party. I hope it makes sense. I've got a few things to say, but I was up till Soho till 4 in the morning, so I'm just a bit fuzzy. Well, one of the things I was thinking about as the speakers were talking is about the difference between revolution and reform in relation to the LGBT movement. I think it's very, for me personally, it's very interesting that if I lived in St Petersburg in 1919, I could marry, but in Britain in 2012 I can't. And whilst especially organisations like GLF and things, and the gay movement has sprung up after Stonewall, really it's taken, 50 years, and we've done less than what the Bolsheviks did in the space of 2. So I think it's just makes the point that revolutionaries actually make them less reformists. We want equality, but the way we get equality is by fighting for something more, and we want something more down on straight people as well. I don't want to work my fingers to the bone just to put food on the table for my kids, and I don't want straight people to have to do that either. I don't particularly want equality under an oppressive society. I think it was interesting what Noel was saying as well, that parts of the movement do have this, and certainly capitalists and oppressors, do have this tendency of picking off what bourgeois elements and it's overwhelmingly white, upper middle class, male, monogamous, gay or lesbian, but not bisexual or transgendered or queer or genderqueer, and giving these people some sort of equality, giving them some sort of acceptability, respectability, and then that gives them an incentive to hold on to that and to not support more radical, less heteronormative, less acceptable elements of the movement. So we see Stonewall, which absolutely disgracefully does not support trans people, queers, genderqueers, and so on. And I think it's really important when people are talking about the fact that LGBT liberation is part of a much wider struggle. That's not just a principle, that's not just I hate all oppression, I'm going to fight against all oppression. It's actually a tactical necessity and reality.
Hi, yeah, I'm also from South Africa, except I've lived in the UK for 13 years, and it's really good hearing the South African comrades talk about, well, not good actually, quite frightening hearing the comrades talk about what things are like today, because when I came over here, we just not only won our first ANC government in the end of apartheid, but also the Bill of Rights, which enshrined the non-discrimination on the basis of sexuality in the Bill of Rights, and that was a cause for huge celebration, and the movement that I was part of then, the Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Equality, fought really hard to try and include black and white activists and really build as broad a base as possible to really deepen LGBT politics and the cause of LGBT politics into the broader movement in South Africa at the time. And I remember when I first came to the UK, I was really smug about the rights that we'd won and the advances that we'd made, because the UK seemed quite backward to me then. But actually 13 years later, when you listen to the comrades speak, you realise just how much there's still to fight for. And the stories about oppression in South Africa and how it continues today really brings home the fact that at the time I would never have thought an ANC government would allow comments about HIV being a Western imposition, about homosexuality being imported from the West and so on. But it does tell us a story about inequality and liberation and how we fight to achieve it, because I remember a young black activist saying in an election meeting in South Africa that he didn't feel the need to vote because this was after the first round of elections. He didn't feel the need to vote because in his mind, while economic inequality still existed, he would never be free. And I think that was a really important lesson for me, and it was part of my becoming a socialist and joining the Socialist Workers' Party when I got here, was really that lesson of unless we challenge the system, and the system continued to exist in South Africa after the elections, the ANC never did away with capitalism, and I think that the hopes and the dreams that millions of people had in South Africa still exist. But I think they're revolutionary dreams, and unless we get rid of the system, and of course we have to fight for reforms in the here and now, but we're not going to achieve the kind of liberation I think we're all talking about unless we can actually stand together and fight to smash it.
My name is Paula, I'm from Liverpool SWP, and I just wanted to explore a little bit some things that we've been touching on, which is the relationship really between different forms of oppression in terms of how it informs us in organising the fight back. And I think the socialists have got a really key role to play in an understanding of oppression, because the thing is that the thing about oppression is that actually when it comes to homophobia, the person who you're most likely to experience homophobia from, especially early on, the person that you're most likely to experience homophobia from is somebody from your own class, and in fact it's somebody from your own classroom, most likely, since homophobic abuse is absolutely endemic in schools. And I think that we have to have an understanding, and it's not that oppression within class that oppressive attitudes within class doesn't exist, but it's the key question that we're asking is, who does this benefit? So when you experience homophobia, or experience racism, or you experience sexism, the key question that socialists have to be putting is who benefits from this. So quite clearly, if the EDL is on the attack, if LGBT community doesn't link up with, for example, the Muslim community and other communities in fighting back, it's quite clear to see that it's the EDL who benefits. And that's much more subtle than just an understanding that either it doesn't exist or it's something that somehow we can ignore, which isn't the case at all. And I think that socialists have a key role in that, because there isn't necessarily a natural affiliation between different oppressed groups, because they obviously can find that is very divisive, which of course is ruling class that benefits at the end of the day, because it's ways of dividing us from fighting together. And just thinking of last year's Pride and one way in which this came out very strongly, I was going to say that trade unions have played a key role, and our role in trade unions has played a key role in making that clearer. In Pride, you get big delegations, sometimes from organisations, say like Tesco's or something. Last year, when the FBU marched, they refused to march with the London Fire Service, which normally they would have marched with, because they were in dispute with the London Fire Service, and they understood that their interests were different to the interests of the London Fire Service. Anyway, just coming on to, I am an LGBT rep for my union, and that is partly about looking at the structures of the union, but it's partly about an understanding that LGBT issues must be part of the trade union agenda and part of the trade union industrial agenda. So we are looking forward to next autumn. We have a series of issues which we're fighting about, some of them to do with education, which is where I work, a lot of them to do as well with pensions. And part of our fight back is ensuring that the LGBT issues are central to that fight back, but ensuring more than anything else is that we build a strong fight back where we're able to challenge this, we'll challenge the so-called austerity measures and strike a very serious blow to the government that we have.
My name is Rachel, I'm part of the SWSS at UEL and the SWP in East London. Mine's more of a question really rather than a contribution. I don't know if you've been watching, anybody's been watching Big Brother, but generally the housemates that go into Big Brother are different from the society and people that people want to watch. So I don't know if you've heard about Luke A, I think it is, who's gone through gender reassignment. I just wanted to know if you think this is to, because he's different from other people and they're kind of saying like, you know, how different he is, or whether it's about like realising that people are different, you know, and kind of like celebrating the fact that, you know, he's come through society and how proud he is of it and how he can talk about it. I know that he was quite, you know, frightened at the start. I just wanted to know what you thought about it.
I just want to say a few words in the name of Terence Higgins Trust, which is obviously quite a well-known charity in the LGBT community. I, for about a year and a half, worked as what they called a young leader a couple of years back for Terence Higgins Trust, with the aim of sort of using young people to try and provide sexual relationship education, particularly in the LGBT community, for other young people. Our funding was cut. There are many HIV outreach testing centres, particularly focused around the LGBT men particularly, and they're not just outreach centres, they're there for support for LGBT men suffering from HIV, testing centres and focus on homeless people. Half of them have been closed due to budget cuts. Terence Higgins Trust, when in London there were the riots and many shops were destroyed, the government promised them compensation for the damage they received. When the EDL destroyed a HIV outreach centre in England, can't quite remember the city now, it received no compensation. And so I just wanted to say that in these sort of times of austerity, a charity which does a considerably amount of work for the LGBT community, particularly in making sure it has care for those who are suffering from anxiety, abuse, depression, and those who are suffering from sexual health disorders, sexual health infections and sexually transmitted infections. They are having the support they need, desperately restricted in terms of austerity.
Hi, I'm not brilliant at public speaking, so I apologise if I talk a bit fast. Basically, I've got a bit of a question, is that I come from my hometown of Grantham. The term LGBT, you'd say it in the middle of the street and not one person would know what you meant. The word gay is only used as an insult, and people really don't understand what it means. And I'm just worried that within this room we have so much passion and so much knowledge, but it's not out there in the real world. I come from Lincolnshire. We have maybe one Pride march, and that's in Lincoln, which is barely attended. There is no pride, there is no knowledge, there's no discussion. I didn't even know my own sexuality or bi existed until I did sociology at college. There's no mention of it anywhere. I was bullied for being a lesbian at school and nothing happened. It's just the lack of knowledge out there is terrifying. If we really want to make our message heard, how are we going to get people, just focus on ordinary people out there to actually know what LGBT is and why we're struggling and why we're fighting? Because all I've seen from back home is that no one cares. No one cares to learn, no one cares to know what it is. Unless you're an LGBT person, most people really don't pay any attention. And I just feel, how can we make people who aren't LGBT actually want to learn what LGBT is and why we need to support us and why we are going to support them?
Deb's from Liverpool the Socialist Workers' Party and a teacher in Merseyside. A couple of points really, the first of which is related to education. I think it's really, really important, having listened to all the speakers and talking about the fight and how we fight back against the ruling class, I think we also have to be absolutely aware of the ammunition that they are using against us. And certainly within the education system, the fragmentation and the division of the education system into private sponsors and academies is one way back 25, 30 years. You've got academies that are owned by evangelical Christian groups who want to promote Section 28 through the back door. I used to work for one of these academies. Their initial sex and relationships education policy had a line in it that clearly stated that homosexuality would not be promoted within the school and would only be talked about in the context of AIDS, and that was their initial policy. As a trade unionist, we fought against that and we got it repealed and we got the policy completely rewritten. But with the explosion of academies coming onto the scene, we have to watch for this. Second point, very quickly, Lynn Featherstone, who's the Equalities Minister for the Liberal Democrats, said at the LGBT History Month launch last November that LGBT education belongs in PSE lessons and is only an issue for LGBT teachers. This is the government that we are dealing with, but it's no surprise because Cameron seeks the LGBT vote, he courts the LGBT vote, he talks about equal marriage, he talks about cutting aid to countries who criminalise LGBT people, but at the same time he puts LGBT asylum seekers back on the plane to force death, definite prosecution and, an absolutely horrendous end to their life. So we have to be clear about the enemy that we are fighting here, and we do have to join up with other groups that are oppressed, as other speakers have said, because together we are stronger and we can beat them.
I was one of the organisers of East London Pride last September. People will probably know the story that a small number of Muslims went round in January in the East End of London putting up homophobic stickers, and at once people were outraged. But the EDL attempted to take advantage of that. People who were secretly members or associates of the EDL tried to set up their own pride, and we exposed that. Their attempt to set the LGBT and Muslim communities in the East End at each other's throats, and later in the year we were able to organise our own event. Now we had members, leading members, of the LGBT campaigns, people like, for example, Johan Hari, saying that 0% of Muslims supported LGBT people. We had Peter Tatchell saying that LGBT people in the East End, all of us were keeping our head down and had gone back into the closet for fear of offending Muslims. And actually what we saw was a meeting of hundreds of people at London Muslim Centre next to East London Mosque, being addressed as part of building for the protest against the EDL by an open trans woman, with hundreds of people from the local community giving her warm applause. We saw the Muslim mayor of Tower Hamlets come down to our march, put his arm around a drag queen, be photographed and express his solidarity for our struggles. And since then we've seen representatives of the East London Mosque come along and get involved. I spoke on the same platform as them at the Unite Against Fascism conference, talking about how do we fight LGBT oppression. So I think we can unite people. It's a question of on what basis, and I think class is a key thing here, because all of the people who were saying that there is a war going on in the East End were people who did not have the daily experience of working class people in that part of the world, that we live in the same streets, LGBT people and Muslims, we work in the same workplaces, and that therefore we have that experience in common. So it's on the basis of class that we are able to unite. And it was on that basis also, to relate to what the last speaker said, how do you get people involved? It was also on that basis that we were able to get straight people involved through the unions, get donations, for example, from NUT branches, get big coverage in the local press. You have to start from class. It's class that unites people. It's class that taps in to the anger that people feel. We have to start from that approach, rather than stigmatising our Muslim neighbours, and on that basis we can fight back and we can win.
I'll just go to two issues really, and that is to be a bit like Cassandra, because having lived through the period I have done, the illusion that many people have is that it's our struggle is one of pure enlightenment. You spread the word, it's a one-way street, like a river going down to the sea. We enlighten people and the struggle goes one way. That is not the case. It goes up, it goes down, there are reverses. Berlin in the 1920s was one of the most free areas for LGBT people there was. That was not the case in the 1930s. I lived through a great period in the 1970s. By the 1980s, during the AIDS hysteria, it was a horrendous time. I've seen great advances since then, but there were murders in London of gay men. I think Peter Tatchell estimated 2 a week in the height of that period. When you look at the opinion polls of people, it was terrifying, and the campaigns that newspapers like The Sun ran and the Daily Mail would take your breath away. Now they champion Elton John and all the rest of it, but then with a different world. And that is only a few decades ago. It is not a one-way street. You can't just assume we've won something, it's there forever. If this system is there, and to survive it has dividers, these issues do not go away, they reoccur time and time again. We now live in a period of the sort of recession we've not seen in the 1930s, which has an ominous ring for us, as many of the people. If they're cutting away the welfare state, they expect the family to take up the slack, and that means that we're on the firing line, or potentially so. Finding a scapegoat is a classic way, be it racism, or be it homophobia, or transphobia. All these things can come back, so we should be aware of this, and not complacent that in one victory, that will be it. The struggle re-emerges constantly. The other question I was asked about was that, would you ever see the commercial bars be a central struggle again? Well, you'd think not. But yet, I just noted that yesterday, Westminster Council sent a letter to every gay bar on gay pride, because they wouldn't pay money, wouldn't close off Soho, saying that any gay bar allowed music to be played out in the street. If they had people drinking outside of their area, they'll have their licence removed. You know, Westminster Council threatened to close down Soho. You wouldn't think that's even possible to conceive of. I don't think it's going to happen, but I'm saying don't take things for granted. The system renews itself, struggle renews itself, it can go more than one way. And that's really
Comrades, friends, fantastic contributions, full of anger but also determination. Just in terms of the comrades from Bristol, I signed that statement myself, and I'm glad it's been raised, and I hope as many people as possible do go to that. And it is important to note that the far right in recent years have tried to co-opt, in a sense, the gay rights struggle in a perverse fashion. I remember a few years ago, Pim Fortuyn, far-right Dutch leader, who was himself gay, and used that to justify outright Islamophobic attacks. The BNP today still don't make any pretences, they're still deeply homophobic. But the EDL, of course, do attempt to cynically use that. And I just recall, in terms of standing as we must, with Muslim brothers and sisters as they face Islamophobic attack in this country. In the 19th century, August Bebel, a German socialist, called anti-Semitism the socialism of fools, because it disguised itself, it clothed itself in anti-capitalist rhetoric, Jewish bankers and financiers, and so on. And today, I think Islamophobia is the secularism of fools. It clothes itself in secularist garbs in order to attack groups like particularly Muslims in this country. And as LGBT people, we cannot let that happen. In terms of building the bubble, a comrade from Grantham, I think, was talking about it. The birthplace of Thatcher, I have to say I wasn't that surprised it not being particularly fertile ground. The struggle for LGBT rights, but it is true, we have to make sure we don't live in a bubble, and that's why our struggle has to be linked up with the struggles everywhere else. We're not self-contained, we're not just LGBT people, and that class difference is absolutely key, because we're all affected in so many different ways, and that's why we have to build that coalition. I mean, in terms of the scene itself, I mean, we'll need that, if you like, for years to come, but in a sense it is a necessary evil. Our social segregation has been imposed upon us because of our oppression. Now, I'm not saying eventually we'll get rid of all gay or LGBT bars or anything, but we do need to fight, in a sense, to end, if you like, even coming out as an event. That is the struggle, I think, in the long term. That's what we're struggling for. But as for now, we have to link our struggles against all the other oppressed groups, particularly those being slammed by austerity. We stand together, we fight together, and we win together.
we can see that there is a battle on really to defend the things that we've won. I've sat in a number of meetings in terms of the LGBT course. You hear from the guy today talking about the impact of the cuts in HIV funding. There was a young trans woman talking this morning about how in her city there isn't a single service that she can access in terms of getting support, and that is just the beginning. We know that a tiny percentage of the cuts so far have been driven through, and I think in terms of how we respond to that, there is also a battle on. It's the two souls really that Noel talked about in terms of the shape of the movement. Between those that we saw yesterday at Pride, who were happy to allow Barclays Bank to lead the Pride with their Barclays uniforms and try and wrap the Israeli flag around the rainbow flag, and those who were marching with anger against the bankers and the cuts and unfurling their Palestinian flag. And we have to do everything we can to strengthen that second side, because that is going to be essential if we're going to be effective in terms of taking on these attacks, in terms of joining and building a wider resistance against austerity. But it's also going to be essential if we are to really achieve that vision for liberation that the Stonewall rioters talked about in 1969. Because I think what the comrades said about South Africa is really, really important. You know, when they were in the heat of the revolutionary struggle, all the divisions began to melt away. There was a confidence and an expectation about what was possible. People felt that powerful in the struggle and that they could begin to reshape another world. But with the revolution defeated, things started to roll back. You have a country where many people don't have jobs, don't even have access to electricity, to water, and that is where desperation sets in and the rotten old scapegoating begins to set in with it. And that's why our struggle has to be a struggle against capitalism. Oscar Wilde once said that a map of the world that doesn't include utopia isn't even worth looking at. And I think that's right. But I think our map has to have an idea of how we get to that utopia. It's not that we can judge every road and so on. I mean, I was in the meeting just before now on the Egyptian revolution, where you heard Hossam talking about how on the day that the thing started, January the 25th, they had no idea that they were going to the square to begin a revolution. But we can try and learn from the past what's been effective and what's weakened our side. We can build into our struggle an understanding of why oppression is important, and the fight against oppression has to be part of the wider struggles that are entering. We can have a strategy for how we build unity and a movement that can win. And that is what the SWP is trying to do. If you listen to the struggles that we've talked about, taking on the divisions and uniting people against the EDL, through to initiatives that people have organised to make sure that people feel more confident about coming out in their school and their workplace. And that's why I would really encourage people to join the SWP, because we know that more struggles are coming. But the question is, are their struggles going to win? And I just want to come back on the woman from Lincolnshire who talked about, I'm finishing, who talked about the question about how do you deal with the fact that there's homophobia, people don't necessarily even know what LGBT means, and so on. And I think the key thing about that is it's the struggle. It's finding things that are making people angry and joining cause with them. And I think that's the exciting thing about the period we're in, that lots of people who wouldn't have seen themselves as activists or political are being forced to move into action because of the attacks that are raining on them. And that is the key to then beginning a process of also making the connections of winning people to why the struggle that they're engaged with also has to be part of and linked to the struggle against oppression. And I want to finish with a quote from a woman miner, involved in the South Wales Women's Support Group during the miners' strike. And she put it like this, she said, we turned our backs on lesbian and gays. We didn't have anything to do with them. It had nothing to do with us. We might have felt sorry for them, but what could you do? For years that was our attitude. But suddenly, during the strike, we were up for grabs. We were being attacked by the police, the media, the state. And we began to realise that we had to sympathise with that oppressed group because we were oppressed too. And that's a really brilliant example of how struggles that you can have no connection with the question of sexual politics or liberation can also begin to bring those questions to the fore. But it's not an automatic process, it's one that we have to fight for. Let's build the hot autumn, but let's also be organised to ensure that we're building a struggle that's going to win. Join the SWP today.